It wasn't very long ago that we discussed Howard Phillips Lovecraft on the Chrononauts podcast. We probably won't be doing this too many more times, but there may be a couple of other stories that we'll want to talk about from him. And essentially, we just wanted to do this one because it's wild and over the top and fits in with our theme for this month. This is not perhaps one of the most, I guess, well-done Lovecraft stories in the sense that it's not part of his overarching cosmic mythos. It's not, it won't give you the sense of cosmic breadth and so on that some of his other tales do. But it is actually quite enduring in public consciousness, surprisingly, considering its publication in Homebrew Journal.
Yeah. What an odd publication title, I gotta say. I mean, we've been doing this for a little while now, and we've encountered all kinds of magazines and journals and newspapers, but yeah, Homebrew Journal. What else do you think appeared in there?
So, this story appeared in the Homebrew Journal from February to July 1922. It is a serial that appeared in 6 episodes. And yes, the Homebrew Journal was an amateur publication in the eastern United States, and I don't know what the readership was or anything like that, but significantly for H.P. Lovecraft, this was the first story that he got paid for, and he got paid $5 per installment. The payments after episode 2 were delayed and late, but they did eventually come in, apparently. So the manuscript was submitted to Homebrew Journal on single-spaced typed pages. Lovecraft apparently really hating typing and not wanting to type and still not remembering to double space, which was something that we brought up in our Dagon discussion where he was actually asked to retype the thing years later. But this was before the advent of Weird Tales and before Weird Tales' interest in Lovecraft. And even though he had a few stories that were written between 1918 and 1922, 1923, that later on became more widely circulated and known, at this point in time, he was not a well-published writer. And this story was very significant for him in the sense that, yes, it's the first work that he got a paycheck for. And some of his earlier stories later did get published in Weird Tales and did get acclaim. And even, we can't forget that Lovecraft, between roughly 1915 and 1921, actually ran his own paper called The Conservative, which was his journal, and that published mostly his own thoughts and received a fair amount of criticism from certain people around, one of whom became his best friends. His name is Morton, and he's actually mentioned in S.T. Joshi's biography, I Am Providence. And Joshi actually spends quite a bit of time talking about Lovecraft's prejudices and his racial prejudices and stuff and how much of a problem that was.
Right.
And that also comes up in this story.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, and I really want to talk about that this episode because I think that there is a problem in that I think that all of us, to an extent, certainly I am rather positively disposed toward Lovecraft. I like his work. He was hugely influential to my reading and my feelings about weird fiction and stuff like that. And I want Lovecraft's work to be celebrated in as much as it can be. But at the same time, these negative aspects of him are worth talking about. And I've noticed among certain fans of people who may have problematic tendencies and prejudices and beliefs that we may not necessarily endorse, is that they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to acknowledge it, and they don't want to... It's almost like they get angry at people who actually want to seriously address this and talk about it like it's a real thing. And I don't understand that. I think that it's... If you do appreciate somebody's work, especially, you should be willing to talk about these things.
Right.
And bring them up. And like... The thing is, in that period of his life, like between the late 1910s and early 1920s, was when Lovecraft was really most vocal about his racial prejudices. And that came through a lot in The Conservative and other places that he was writing at that time. And he got heavily criticized for this at that time. So it's not like people can just say, oh, it was the 1900s. People were just like that. Like, it was just packed for the time that was normal. Like, no, there were, I mean, people kind of assume that people living 100 years ago were all stupid or something, and they all, like, they can't be held to any kind of standard. Like, it's
Certainly the racism of stories from that time are a lot more overt than it is now.
Yeah, but I think sometimes that creates an illusion that, like, oh, that's just the way everybody was back then. Like,
right.
You know,
certainly not everybody, but I would say a fair amount of people. There's certainly authors we've read on the podcast that are like way more racist than Lovecraft is, but it comes out in this story, unfortunately. And I said in the last time we covered Lovecraft that I thought people trying to connect Dagon with anti-Semitism were stretching a bit, but there's really no stretching here to tie this one to his racial prejudices and fears, because they're really coming out in a very obvious way, and it's pretty unnecessary, and it does detract from the story in that it doesn't take up a huge word counter proportion of the story, but it just feels like a really ugly blemish that didn't need to be there.
Yeah, but that's part of the problem, I think, is that these kind of prejudices and beliefs, it's kind of like it's a sickness, right? And when I first read this story when I was a kid, I didn't really notice any of that. I didn't really think about it. I didn't think it was significant. And now I can kind of see, like, how it reflects the personality of the creator. And it's interesting. It's interesting to come to it. I personally think that Lovecraft was a person capable of psychological growth. And I do think that, although there's some contention about this, I do think that in general, it did seem like he was adjusting his views later on in life.
Yeah.
And I've seen some of his letters and some of the things he said. And it just, even though nobody said, hey, Mr. Lovecraft, are you still a racist asshole? I kind of feel like he was starting to change his tune a lot. And, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that he was capable of it. And even one of his critics, that Morton in 1915, who was, like, responding to The Conservative, basically said, I can tell that Mr. Lovecraft is a very young man, and I can tell that he's just falling into these things because he can't justify them. He just sort of assumes that they're true. And if there's one good thing about Mr. Lovecraft, it's that he's sincere, and maybe one day he will become a powerful writer. And, you know, it's this sort of, like, broadside that was pretty viciously cutting up Howard Lovecraft, but at the same time giving him a little bit of praise. And apparently, like, this actually did affect Lovecraft a lot. And although he had written to his friends saying he was going to, like, make this rebuttal against this guy, he never actually did. And, you know, it's just kind of interesting. He wrote this poem about some of his detractors, and it's pretty neat and pretty clever, actually. And it's sort of a little bit off scope, so I'm not really going to talk about it too much. But it's just kind of interesting that Lovecraft was writing all the time, and a lot of the stuff that he wrote didn't actually, like, it wasn't stories, it was letters, and it was correspondence, and it was just random scraps of poetry that he wrote that never really saw publication till decades and decades after his death. And from that kind of stuff is how we learn a lot about what kind of person Lovecraft really was. And I think that it is actually worth going into a little bit of that stuff, because, I mean, nowadays especially, you know, Lovecraft raises a lot of questions, right? I mean, we kind of have this idea in popular culture that Lovecraft is this hugely influential writer who is also very xenophobic, and, like, people wonder about that. And I think a lot of them maybe have only read a little bit of his work or have only heard about it and don't really necessarily know how to parse it and what it means. And I think this is kind of one of these instances where it actually does help a little bit to read a little bit into the artist and know a bit about what he was actually like. So, Herbert West Reanimator was published in 6 episodes. It is very obviously published in 6 episodes.
Yeah.
We've done a couple of serials before, and this was kind of a fact of pulp fiction, essentially, where it's very recognizable to modern audiences, or should be. A lot of TV shows are like this nowadays, where you get, like, every week a new episode in the same story that's gradually advancing it forward. And sometimes, yes, it's very gradual indeed. But Lovecraft wrote these 6 episodes, and there's evidence suggesting that he wrote them several months apart in time. So the way I read this time around, this is not the way I read it first time around, which was like listening to an audiobook and listening to it all at once. The way I read it this time around, I didn't read more than an episode a day. And that, I think, helps.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's how the story was meant to be taken in. Every episode was a month. Like, each month was an episode, right? So each one starts with a recap of the previous episode. And that's kind of something you just get used to. And apparently, the editor of the magazine, the Homebrew magazine, was actually supposed to do these parts. And he actually, I don't know, they're not even in the heavily annotated, huge Lovecraft books that I have. But there were originally some kind of head notes that were supposed to summarize everything, but actually didn't. So when Lovecraft submitted his next story to Homebrew, which was The Lurking Fear, he specifically requested that the editor of the magazine provide the headnotes that he was supposed to provide. Because apparently the headnotes in the actual magazine were like really, really bad or something. They didn't really say anything. Like, it almost seemed like it wasn't for this story. So he's like, yeah, do your job, right? Like, I don't have to do this every installment, do I?
Yeah, because I mean, with the Skylar we did last episode, they had the plot summary of the previous episodes printed in like small italic text before the story begins. And the story just continues. Yeah. It doesn't waste any time recapping, whereas some of these chapters, it feels like he spends at least like half the word count of the chapter like recapping what happened previously.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was that much, but I think that it did kind of lead to some episodes being anticlimactic a little bit. Like, it's kind of every episode has the same format, and they all end in something like really horrible until the final episode, which ends in something like so horrible that it's the final episode. Right. Yeah. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, I do think I remember when I first read this, it was several years ago, and I read it all at the same time, and I did not know that it was serialized. I did have this thought of like, why do we have to start every chapter with like this really long explanation of what I just read?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it is weird. Like, it does feel weird. I mean, now, I can't help think of all those episodes of DS9 where you're tuning in and it starts out, there's a voice that goes, last time on Deep Space Nine. And it just like recaps like a whole bunch of key scenes from the episode.
Yeah. Previously on Herbert West Reanimator.
Yeah. Last time on Reanimator. Yeah.
You got Jeffrey Combs in both, so.
Yeah.
So, an interesting thing with Lovecraft, too, and adaptations is Lovecraft, again, I don't want to hide this. Like, I really like Lovecraft. I think he's great. But I also think it's quite obvious that he has his sort of limitations that make him perhaps not the storyteller that everyone wants to read. And one of those limitations is that he doesn't really do dialogue. He doesn't do characters. It's like all that stuff is sort of not interesting to him. And so whenever you do an adaptation of his work, and there have been a couple of this work, you have to add all that stuff to it, and you have to add your own interpretations of the way the characters might think, and the dialogue, and the way it goes, and all that. And you kind of have to do it yourself. And I don't mind that. I don't mind that he makes you do that. He makes you do that a little bit of extra work just to identify with something, right? With someone. And it's interesting. It's a fault on one level. But on another level, it's like, yeah, if you get to enjoy a writer like Lovecraft, you just kind of accept that. You just accept that he's not going to show you much about the characters. There's probably not going to be dialogue in the sense that you would recognize it. If it is, it might be some weird New England country guy speaking in dialect. Right. I don't know. I think it works pretty well. Like, it's kind of fun to imagine how these stories play out. And I know when I first heard this story, it was in an audio form, and it was read by somebody that I think I might have talked about when we did the Dagon episode, and it was in the same book. And it was just really cool to hear him read this. This story it's very over the top, but it's over the top in a way that Lovecraft is not always. Lovecraft generally is considered a writer who is a little bit overboard with certain writing styles and adjectives and stuff like that. But it's not always true. And not only that, but he gets carried away sometimes, but he's very selective about when he gets carried away. He lets the getting carried away happen at very specific moments where it will hit you the hardest. This one, it almost feels like he had this idea that he was writing for this like really lurid, sort of grotesque kind of audience, like maybe the magazine. I don't know what was normally published in Homebrew, but it just kind of feels like he's writing a little differently than he would for like the Weird Tales audience later on. It feels like he's really deliberately being extravagantly over the top in a way that's like funny. Like he's being a little bit smirky about it, and a little bit like, I don't think he takes this seriously quite in the way that he does the Call of Cthulhu or something like that.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, more tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah. And I think he's like, even later on, when we'll get to it when we do the summary, but like later on when he talks about certain things, the racism thing, I think that he's being a little bit like goofy about it. Lovecraft, even though most people wouldn't think about this, some, background material that I've read and so on suggests that he did actually have a sense of humor. But it was very subtle and not really something that everybody would bust a belly laugh about, right? But it was there, and I think it shows through in a few places in this story. I think that the over-the-topness is deliberate in a way, and S.T. Joshi even suggests that it's a self-parody, which is funny because it's pretty early in Lovecraft's career for him to be parodizing himself, but still, I kind of get that. And I mean, he is the most, very, very definitely the most intensely enmeshed in the subject matter Lovecraft scholar. So, I mean, it's worth considering when he might say that it's a self-parody, and it's certainly maybe a parody of this type of storytelling. But it's also not that late in time. We're talking 1922. So this predates a lot of the other pulp stuff that we've read so far. So, I'm going to name the episodes because the titles of the episodes are cool. They add to the atmosphere. Episode 1. From the Dark. Memories and possibilities are forever more hideous than realities. The narrator of our story is more fearful than ever, now that his friend of over 17 years is gone, and under dark and violent circumstances. The narrator and Herbert West were friends and both studying in medical school at Miskatonic University. By the way, this is the first instance in Lovecraft's oeuvre of Miskatonic University and the town of Arkham, which is a sort of make-believe equivalent of Wessex you might say, Thomas Hardy's famous creation in England.
Right, yeah. A couple other authors did the same thing. Faulkner and his Mississippi County.
Yeah, they just like create these kind of
yeah.
backgrounds for their stories to take place in. And we see Arkham and Miskatonic mentioned several times in Lovecraft's most famous mythos fiction and stuff. And here's where it starts. I believe the Miskatonic River was mentioned in a 1920 story, The Picture in the House. But other than that, yeah, this is the first mention of the fictional town and the university that houses a copy of the Necronomicon, among other things,
yeah, right.
of course. So, Herbert had a fascination, a specific thing that was a spell, but also held the narrator to him. He has been torturing and killing and working his way up the animal food chain from rabbits to monkeys. To what end? Well, to reanimate the stopped machinery of life, of course. He's had results. They haven't been very nice. They usually try to kill him. He wants to move up to humans, naturally. But the medical faculty won't consider it. The dean says, absolutely not. But why? There's no such thing as a soul. Nothing but automatic chemical processes. Now, West's solution doesn't work to stop death. It only works with freshly killed cadavers. West must get fresh human cadavers. So he and his friend debate which cemetery to loot from. Potter's Field or Christ Church. The corpses in Christ Church are useless, being largely embalmed. So, Potter's Field it shall be. Like any trailblazing scientists doing it for the science, they need a secret base and laboratory. So, an abandoned farmhouse they move into, and set up their lab and operating room. The sinister haunt of science is what the narrator calls it. They can't afford an incinerator, so decide to bury the failed experiments in the cellar. Big mistake, if you ask me. They hear of a newly dead person in the news somewhere. A strong, young guy who's drowned. Free of psychological complexities, says West, but how they could know that, as he's dead, who knows, really. But yes, that's all just too bad. Well, it's down to Potter's Field they go to do some grave robbing. They successfully get their corpse back and try their unexplained solution. And nothing seems to happen for a good 45 minutes. And they're just about to resign themselves to failure, West concluding that there is an error in the formula. And they're in the lab making up solution, and then this happens. The awful event was very sudden and wholly unexpected. I was pouring something from one test tube to another, and West was busy over the alcohol blast lamp, which had to answer for a Bunsen burner in this gasless edifice, when from the pitch-black room we had left there burst the most appalling and demoniac succession of cries that either of us had ever heard. Not more unutterable could have been the chaos of hellish sound if the pit itself had opened to release the agony of the damned. For in one inconceivable cacophony was centered all the supernal terror and unnatural despair of animate nature. Human it could not have been. It is not in man to make such sounds. And without a thought of our late employment or its possible discovery, both West and I leaped to the nearest window like stricken animals, overturning tubes, lamp, and retorts, and vaulting madly into the starred abyss of the rural night. So, that didn't go very well.
They don't have very good luck in this story, I have to say.
Yeah. And the next day, they see that their base has been burned down. Also, someone reported a grave disturbed at the potter's field, but not by them, by someone clawing futilely at the soil, as if trying to get in. And from that point on, Herbert West always looks behind him with a shudder. And now, he's disappeared. Episode 2, The Plague Demon. So, I really like the way this chapter starts. It starts with another, and yes, there is a recap of what came before, but before that, we get this awesome opening, and just imagine yourself in August 1922, reading the Homebrew Journal, and this is the first paragraph that you read of this story from this upstart New Englander, Howard Lovecraft. It goes, I shall never forget that hideous summer, 16 years ago, when like a noxious afrit from the halls of Eblis, typhoid stalked leeringly through Arkham. It is by that satanic scourge that most recall the year. For truly, terror brooded with bat wings over the piles of coffins in the tombs of Christ Church Cemetery. Yet, for me, there is a greater horror in that time. A horror known to me alone, now that Herbert West has disappeared. So, that year, the two graduated students are pressed into service. It's quite convenient for them in a way, there being so many dead people about. Also, the medical faculty is extremely taxed and disorganized. They smuggle a body into the dissecting room, and the faculty is still saying no to the whole idea of reanimation. They're most opposed, though the heroic Dean Halsey is apparently very gentle about it. But West doesn't notice that. He's just pissy about everything. So they attempt to revive the body they just got into the room, but the corpse only comes to for a few seconds, stares in absolute horror at the ceiling, and then collapses. When his main opponent, the Dean, Halsey, dies, everyone's out drinking, and West convinces the narrator that they should have a night of it. The result is that they all struggle home drunk at 2 a.m. with a third unidentified figure. An hour later, the landlady and her husband are awakened to the sound of terrible cries and crashing. The room has been smashed to bits. And the narrator and West are both unconscious. That night, someone is attacked in the cemetery, and several houses are broken into by something horrible and bestial. 19 poor Arkham citizens are killed. It's described by some townsfolk as something like a malformed ape. Sometimes it eats its victims. It's actually a man of some kind, though. They capture him finally and wound him. He's voiceless and mad and violent. He's carted off to an asylum and spends 16 years there, howling in rage and banging his head against the walls. Until the mishap, of course. The mishap that also results in West's eventual disappearance. The form, the hideous creature, is the gentle Halsey, brought to by West's experiments in a ghastly attempt to prove their efficacy. He was entombed for 3 days, and I guess somehow he developed superhuman strength while decaying. Don't know. It's funny because I kind of pictured Halsey as this, like, gentle old guy with white hair and, like, very, very, like, meek and unassuming. And he turns into this, like, superhuman monster just by being in the grave, apparently.
Yeah, this is, I guess, one of the few plot points that the film takes from the story is the
Mhm.
Dean being, I guess,
Yeah.
reanimated and then stuck in the asylum with a padded cell.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the film, we're definitely going to talk about Stuart Gordon's Reanimator film, and that it's an interesting reading of this, and it is kind of funny what he decided to take from it and what he didn't.
Mhm.
And there are certain things about that. So, yeah, I just thought it was funny that, like, somehow he became this formidable monster, right? Like, I get where he was going with this. He was just saying, like, even the most gentle, good-natured person, when they're revived in this way, they become like a bestial monster, and it's terrifying. But at the same time, it's like he was a frail old guy. How did he turn into this unstoppable beast? Right? It's cute though. I don't mind. It's just kind of funny. So West says it wasn't quite fresh enough, and that's what he's musing through his bandages. Episode 3. 6 Shots by Midnight. I really love the titles of the episodes, by the way. I think they're great.
Yeah.
And they just like get better as it goes on. And I think it's worth the dealing with the recaps and the serialization and everything just for those great episode titles. 6 Shots by Midnight is definitely
It's a good
classic.
One. Yeah.
Mhm.
So now West, and I don't know, in the film his name is Dan, his accomplice, and in the Dark Adventure Radio Theater audio version they did this really cute thing of naming his assistant Gordon Stewart.
Right.
So we can say Dan or Gordon and Herbert West now have a practice of their own in a small mill town right near a graveyard, of course, with a laboratory in the cellar, of course. What follows is a kind of montage of failed and semi-failed resurrections. The partial successes are worse than the outright failures, hideous and insane. And they worry about the one in the cell and the early one that got away. Now, the town they're in is a bit rough. Lovecraft makes them out to be polyglot, which is a bad thing, although Puritanism is no great alternative, which he also points out quite gladly. There are often boxing matches among the inhabitants, boxing being illegal in this part of New England, and they bet on the results. So they import a big black man from Harlem, and an Irish youth knocks him out. The doctors show up, and in fact, the Harlem Smoke is not just KO'd, but dead. And this is when Lovecraft's ugly prejudices definitely come through loud and clear as he describes the Harlem Smoke in the most unflattering way possible. And, of course, they try to revive the giant in the lab, and it doesn't seem to work. And West actually theorizes that it's because he's been testing his solution on white subjects, and for some reason it doesn't work on a black person. But it's about to be proven most definitively wrong. So it's at this point that West is almost killed by the husband of a patient he failed to save. An Italian peasant with a strong vein of superstition and a weak heart. And the woman dies. The husband is insane with rage and guilt, and their child is missing, which is the thing that started all this mess in the first place. So they hear something at the door then, and West grabs a gun, and they fling the door open. The Harlem Smoke has crawled from the grave for vengeance. He's holding the mangled, partially devoured remains of a child's arm. And he gets 6 bullets and is dead once again. And then we go to episode 4. The Scream of the Dead. So West continues to be firmly of the belief that the reason his experiments keep failing is that the corpses aren't fresh enough. The years pass, and West only becomes more driven, more fanatical. But the fear is with them always. And now, West has developed an embalming solution that can be instantly reversed to keep bodies fresh and static for longer. Now, a random traveler from St. Louis finds his way to their cottage, having really stressed himself out getting lost and wandering in, I guess, bad conditions. And according to West, he drops dead almost on the spot. The narrator has been away to his family for vacation. For West, this seems to be an awesome opportunity. The solutions are injected, and they wait. The cadaver opens his eyes, seems to speak. Only now. Only now what? Only now becoming aware? But then, it seems to see West. Claws at the ear, and screams, articulating, "Help! Keep that needle away, you tow-headed fiend!" And then it collapses into a final, inescapable death. So now, West definitely doesn't seem to be above murder to get the freshest possible corpse. And it's kind of starting to wonder, if it has to be that fresh, is there really a great point to all these experiments? But our man, Gordon or Dan or whoever he is kind of starting to realize, I think, that by this point, Herbert West just loves death. And he just loves being around death. And he loves the idea that he might know what lies beyond, even though he claims to be this arch-materialist kind of person. And we move to episode 5, The Horror from the Shadows. So West is very eager, avid even, to go to war. He hopes for a great war. Well, one comes. It's Herbert West, the war years, and he drags the narrator off with him, because of course. And I don't really know what ties these two together. Is it love? Lovecraft doesn't say, but we can speculate. Doesn't really seem to be the animation of the dead. But at any rate, actually, if you thought West being eager to go to war was some kind of patriotism, think again. Actually, it's the narrator who really is getting all jingoistic about the war. He realizes that at this point, West just loves the charnel house. The bodies have to be so fresh for the solution to work. He's eyeing healthy people with a malicious intent. Now, from his last major experiment, he knows that rational thought can be restored. He's taken a step back, though, in a way, experimenting on detached body parts, limbs, and especially heads. He's figured out how to create endlessly surviving tissues and cells artificially. These are made from reptile cells somehow, and it's at this point I'm surprised Lovecraft misses the trick of mentioning Alexis Carrel and his experiments, because it seems like it would have been a perfect insertion. And he did mention Haeckel earlier, and so he's not... It seems like he was checking up on this kind of stuff and knew what was happening. But I thought of the experiments where Alexis there claimed that he could keep these cells operating in immortality, essentially. So that seems to be what West has done, and he can graft these cells onto real human organs. Many specimens, though, are shot in the military hospital laboratory. Now, there's a man, a Major Sir Eric Moreland Clapham Lee, DSO, who has an interest in reanimation. And this is kind of a very sudden insertion, which is a big deal in the film. But what I thought was really funny is about the film, obviously Major Eric Morwood Clapham Lee is DSO is too much of a mouthful, so they named him Hill, which is actually just the name of Lee's pilot. It's just so funny that they just they pick this totally random guy who's not really a part of the story. His name is Ronald Hill, and he's the pilot who got Clapham Lee to wherever they were on the French battlefield or something, or maybe Belgium or something. I don't know.
His name was just short enough.
Yeah,
it's just funny that you can kind of picture them going, oh, yeah, that's too much of a mouthful. This Hill guy, he was the pilot. Yeah, he'll be the adversary. And, of course, the film, really focuses on West and the narrator in university. So it doesn't really go... there's no Herbert West, the Warriors. There's no moving around all over the place. And I kind of like the way... and we'll talk about it more at the end, but I kind of like the way this story is more Herbert West is always on the run, and he's always moving somewhere else, and he's always fearful. And it's kind of more like the Frankenstein of the Hammer films almost. Where he's always having to. It's not safe here anymore, so I have to go somewhere else and start practicing again.
Yeah, I mean it's a 17-year journey from start to finish.
Yeah. So the Major is, of course, an officer of medicine who's helped West in the past. It's the first we've known about it. So he has this other doctor confidant who just sort of comes in. But again, the structure of this story is questionable. It's not. You just kind of roll with it. But he was coming to assist apparently and got shot down over Flanders. So West gets his body, and it's very exciting. Meanwhile, this is a great part. Joshi actually highlights this part too, and he says that it's he thinks this is further evidence that Lovecraft was taking the piss just a little bit. And it's great, but I don't know, it's it's kind of funny. So he says, I can still see Herbert West under the sinister electric light as he injected his reanimating solution into the arm of the headless body. The scene I cannot describe. I should faint if I tried it. There was madness in a room full of classified charnel things with blood and lesser human debris almost ankle-deep on the slimy floor, and with hideous reptilian abnormalities sprouting, bubbling, and baking over a winking bluish-green spectre of dim flame in a far corner of black shadows. It's good, but it's also kind of funny.
Yeah.
He says, the scene I cannot describe, and then he describes ankle-deep slime on the floor. It's this is how careless Herbert West is. He's like Professor Kern throwing the head into the bin,
right?
Times 10. He's just there's shit all over the floor. Yeah. It's really funny. But so the head's in one tank, and the body has been injected. And the head starts screaming at the most opportune moment. It says, "For God's sakes, Arnold, jump!" just as a shell explodes and wrecks the hospital. Supposedly, only Dan Gordon and Herbert survive. And now we've come to episode 6, The Tomb Legions. We've now reached our ultimate death metal song title with The Tomb Legions. Chapter 6, Episode 6, the final episode. So, somewhere in the last episode, or maybe previously, we actually learned that Herbert West did kill a man to get a fresh corpse. And it was certainly hinted at earlier on, and pretty much confirmed here. This is a big part of what really drives Herbert off the edge into moral degeneracy. He's also afraid of his specimens, especially the ones that got away. He's not so sure if the Major is one of those. He thinks if the Major got away, he would have the power to reanimate the dead himself. So, it was kind of where the philosophy of Herbert West was starting to be undermined because he's this diehard materialist. So why does he think that the head is telepathic? And at first I'm thinking, oh, surely the head was able to connect with that specific body because it was his body. But then I'm kind of realizing, oh, actually, it does prove his point because he's saying that actually the head could interact with any body that was waiting for a head. It's just like he's able to somehow send these telepathic signals to affect a body that's waiting for a working brain to activate it. And that could be any brain. So I guess that's what he's saying. And so now he's thinking that this head, for some reason, because it's an operating head without a body, has the power to animate other undead creatures, I suppose.
Some kind of head radio.
Yeah, exactly. And we find out later that, in fact, he can do this. Meanwhile, West has this secret laboratory now in an old house in Boston. And the house is adjacent to an old burial ground dating back to the 1700s, very conveniently. And the workmen find a secret tunnel, which, for some reason, West decides to wall up. Because even though it leads to a burial ground, these are very ancient corpses, and at this time, West is definitely kind of fearful, and he's getting more and more messed up as a person, and he's also starting to feel the sense of encroaching dread that's been building up since the beginning. Now, one day, West is reading the newspaper, and what does he see? A story of a group of weird men breaking into the Arkham Asylum. The leader is a man of military bearing with a wax face and a voice that comes out of a case he's carrying. He's being helped along by a half-eaten corpse. Of course, the paper doesn't come out and say this. They don't know. But that just makes it crazier. The men, the fiends, the corpses, whatever they are, they savage the stuff. At midnight, the bell rings. It's Express! Prepaid! A box! And that would be a great name for the chapter 2. More silly thrash metal than death. Post prepaid. It says it's from Eric Moreland Clapham Lee. And it's here that we learn that the narrator of our tale is being accused of killing West, who has disappeared. And you see, they incinerate the mysterious box, but from a sudden hole in the wall comes the stench of the grave. And a horde of the things Lovecraft describes as grotesquely heterogeneous come pouring through the wall. Yes, we already know what sort of guy you are, Mr. Lovecraft. But actually, the fiends tear Herbert West to pieces, led by a thing with a beautiful head, wearing a Canadian Army uniform, which carries off his head. That is the head of Herbert West. And the narrator, even though he tries to explain what happens, can't account for the fact that the tomb is sealed. And of course, they think he's a mad murderer. And the Tomb Legions? They were so silent. And that is how episode 6 ends.
It definitely has a great end, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, it was a different kind of story. It was, Dagon just sort of did what it needed to do, and that was it. This is a serial that was supposed to carry you on for half a year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I just think it's interesting. People say that Lovecraft is over the top and overly descriptive, and this is almost so in a different way. Like it's he's still kind of trying to find himself, and he was always complaining about having to write to form. Like he didn't like that, and just the way he was a little bit pompous about what he was doing, right? And he talked about it with some of his friends in letters and stuff, and how he was still inspired by tales of the supernatural and happy to write them, but like also saying that he was aware of some of the lowbrow side of the magazines that he was writing for and so on. And I don't know, it almost seems like he's really playing to that kind of thing here and making it extra lurid and extra there's nothing particularly filthy here by modern standards, but the implications are certainly there. Just describing the laboratory at the end is like there's not even a pretense of being a proper medical facility, at this point. It's just like slime all over the floor and dead things everywhere, and every 15 minutes something new's getting shot and it's just and there's definitely some humor to this, like all these failed experiments that just like each one gets away and he never finds it again, and they're all apparently like waiting for this. I guess the Major sort of controls them all.
Yeah, that was the impression I got.
Yeah, like his brain is the ruling brain behind everything, and it's still functioning, and it's able to like he goes to all the different places where these dead people animated by West's solution can be found, and he revives them all or breaks them out of where they are. They're the asylum, for instance, and now they're his minions. And it's just so weird too because he's introduced so late, and like he was kind of sympathetic to West apparently, but now now that he's undead, he's like the priest zombie from City of the Living Dead or something. Like he's just this, like the one that's walking around mind freezing and controlling everyone, like all the dead things. And I don't know, it's cool. I like that. Like it was just sort of abrupt, like it was just one of those things that was introduced at the last moment, and just like we had at a 1700s burial ground at the last moment that like it didn't really have any purpose, but it was very Lovecraft, very like that's exactly what I would picture Lovecraft putting in a story to give it some historical background. But usually in his later stories that would actually come into play somehow, like the 17 ancient, like, or not ancient, but like puritanical New England witch trials and whatnot, like would come into play somehow, and he would get that in there. Here it just seems like some extra thing he threw in just to make it extra gross when there was a hole in the wall and you started smelling the scent of the 100 and 200-year-old corpses and stuff.
Yeah, the pacing of this is definitely not the strongest element of the story. I think serialization and maybe his inexperience as a writer doesn't really help him as far as that goes. But overall, I think it does come together in some kind of satisfying way. I mean, the ending is just awesome.
Yeah. And he can't seem to help but incorporate some of his beliefs in there, like as well as the racism. There's this weird thing about this digression about the Puritans, which are still more or less his favorite people, but they're also really shitty. And he's like the pathetic Puritanism, and he's like kindly, conscientious, and sometimes gentle and amiable, yet always narrow, intolerant, custom-ridden, and lacking in perspective. And it's really funny because he's being so critical of his favorite people, which includes himself.
Right.
Because it's kind of like, even though minus the religious angle, that's kind of the way he was a little bit. And it's it is funny. Like, he's an interesting person with a certain level of self-awareness and intelligence, despite his shortcomings, I think, as a person. But it's weird, too, that Herbert wants to prove that humans are just machines. And he wants to do this by demonstrating that they have no central organizing principle. And yet, here that one brain is able to animate corpses at will. Like being able to do apparently what West can do without the need of a laboratory. And to control these corpses. So, I don't know, it's interesting. Like, West actually seems to have a philosophy that's quite similar to Lovecraft's and his materialism and stuff like that. But it seems like, again, Lovecraft may be poking fun at that a little bit. He may be criticizing it and kind of not taking it entirely seriously. And here's these, like, undead monsters going around savaging people and stuff like that. And we have the Harlem Smoke come back to life. And we have the gentle and frail Halsey turned into a mad cannibalistic beast. Because that's horrible. And that's what we want in a story like this.
Yeah, and there's certainly some greater forces at work.
Yeah. He keeps talking about the thing in the asylum, Halsey, and how horrible he is. So, what is, like, it just kind of made me wonder, does he make regular visits? Like, how does he know all this? Is he getting reports?
Well, there is a newspaper report on his, I guess, being busted out of the asylum by the corpses. Presumably it would describe his condition of...
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of the different takes that you could make on this story. I think this is one of the cool things about this story is Stuart Gordon did the film Reanimator, which is a cool film.
Yeah.
I think we all had fun with it, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a classic.
But there's a lot of other ways you could take this story too, and you could create other versions of this that are really cool if you wanted to. Like, I kind of thought, what about a longer but less episodic version of this story? Or, I don't know, Reanimator as by Clive Barker or something like that. Yeah. Like, you could really do some interesting stuff with this. You could make a television series and make it very episodic again, but with the focus a little different. Make the focus, like episode 3, for example, could be like a police procedural or something like that. And like, you keep it to like one season of 6 or 7 episodes. You can keep it to 6 episodes like the original, right? And you kind of tell a different tale with each one. And then you could do something interesting with that. And if like Clive Barker was doing it, he would probably make you identify more with the undead things, right? And kind of like show what this awesome freak carnival they were or something like that. And I don't know, it would be kind of interesting.
Yeah. I think it would be interesting to see an adaptation cover like that period when they're in the war. I always thought that, like, that part I do remember, like, kind of sticking with me after. I just thought that was a really interesting change of pace after the other excerpts from it.
Yeah, it does really change in tone, and it feels like it's just like a big time skip. Again, it's a problem with how he handles the serialization, but yeah, that's one of the more vivid parts of the story, and I do really like that element. And yeah, like you said, a potential film could focus on so many different things out of this, and the Stuart Gordon film is, I think, a really good adaptation, but it's definitely his own vision. I mean, he only picks very small elements from the story and just really incorporates in his own plot. I mean, the overarching plot of his Reanimator film is not from Lovecraft at all. I mean, he only just takes a couple things and incorporate it beyond the basic
certain
idea.
Concepts.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, there's like weird love triangle and everything, and then it's like it feels like, I mean, as cool as the film is, it's kind of like doing what it needs to do and paring down the scale, making it like smaller scale, but at the same time like concentrating on these specific things, twisting them around a little bit and making them different and doing it well, and just not getting sidetracked, not like going into like, it would have been cool to see them in the First World War and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
It wouldn't have necessarily added, like, it wasn't what they wanted to do with that story. And I think
you could make a great Reanimator movie just focusing on the World War I scenes. You know, have it like really gritty and dark, not like the kind of lighthearted splat sticks tone of the Gordon movie, but something serious and intense, and just focusing on that whole scenario of where there's death all around you at all times, but maybe not necessarily the kind of death that you need for your research.
Yeah, and Wes is actually, like he says, he's doing good things too. Like, he's doing good things and actually helping people, but that's not what he's really interested in. That's his...
It's just a plus, I guess.
Yeah, right.
Not the main idea.
And there's also the Dark Adventure Radio Theater version of this, which is like pretty close to the story. It's like, again, very episodic kind of feeling, but they do a little more with the characters, and they kind of give them personalities and dialogue and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, kind of what you have to do when you're adapting a Lovecraft story.
Yeah, I mean, he has another one that's just not big on the dialogue.
Yeah, just generally didn't. But that's fine, you know, I mean, that's like, it's one of the things that makes Lovecraft difficult to adapt.
Right.
Some people say.
Right.
But I don't think that's like, I don't think that the fact that when you make a screenplay, you have to add certain things, like, I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think that's something to shy away from or shirk, you know? It's like, it's not like you can't make good films out of Lovecraft stories. It's that you have to change them a little bit. You have to add something and maybe take away something else in order to make them work.
Yeah. You need a good scriptwriter, and
Yeah, exactly. That's all you really need. So I don't know. I mean, I don't want to necessarily. I mean, I think it's interesting that the story itself. I don't know. Maybe we're at the point now where like the film might be more known than the story.
I think
don't
it
know.
is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it's hard to say for me. I mean, I feel like a lot of people haven't seen the film, but it's still. I don't know, like it goes down in a certain infamy. It has that scene, the famous scene that like everybody kind of remembers when they point to that movie of the head giving head kind of thing.
Right.
Jeffrey Combs as Herbert West, right? Like he's definitely good in both his Lovecraftian protagonist kind of persona roles.
Yeah, he's great in the role. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think that's really a great bit of casting. Jeffrey Combs is really great as Herbert West. I haven't seen From Beyond yet, but
yeah, and in the film version, you want him to triumph. Like you in this version, you kind of get the feeling that he's just this really fucked up person, and you don't want to be anywhere near him because if you're healthy, he's probably looking at you like he wants to kill you. So you don't want to be anywhere near him, but. Jeffrey Combs and the film make him I mean, he's obviously, like, driven by the science, and one of the first scenes where you see his serum working is when he revives the cat, and, like, the cat's, like, all zombified and evil now, and what was it, he kills the cat, like, twice more? Or something like that, and it's just, like... He's very amused by what's happening almost at the same time too. Like he's kind of like tickled by it, right? So but it's cool. It's a fun portrayal, and you want him to. You kind of feel like he's not the main antagonist. The main antagonist is this other person they created. They name him Hill, which is the name of the Major's pilot in the story, but really he's a fellow academic in the movie, and he's like the rival of Herbert West, even though Herbert is one of his students, I guess.
Yeah, right.
And
I mean, Hill is definitely much more of a creep. You get that like vibe of you really don't like it's compared to him. Like Herbert West is an endearing character where you definitely prefer him over Hill.
Yeah, he's a total scumbag and bastard all around. This Hill character. So yeah, it's different, but it is I guess in some ways a pretty satisfying version of the story. Whereas this one, the original is maybe it needs more connective tissue, and it needs more to be redesigned a little bit and stretched out in different ways and contracted in others, kind of thing. And Lovecraft would have probably admitted that himself. I think that he was probably quite aware of the shortcomings of the story, and S.G. Joshi thinks that he started out in the beginning with a pretty serious intent, but by the time he was done, he was kind of having fun with it. And I think post prepaid, kind of shows us how he thought about it. Like he was goofing around by that point a little bit. That's like something out of like the Creepshow comics or something like that.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you guys think was in the box, by the way?
Maybe it was the head.
Whose head?
The Major.
Well, no, it wasn't the Major, because the Major had his head in a case. He was like ventriloquizing. That was great. That was actually one of the greatest images of the story. It was this like weird waxwork figure with this, and then it's got a head on it, but it's really just the Major's body, and the head is in this like separate case, and it's talking, and it's being held by this other guy, and the head is doing all the talking, but you can't see that it's a head because it's this weird case that's closed. Nobody can see what's in it. That was cool, but yeah, I don't know what was in the box.
Maybe it was just empty, like some sort of ploy,
psychological fake out.
It was definitely going to be something horrible, for sure. Maybe they were going to torment him a little more, but when they found him burning the box, they just got pissed off and like pushed through the wall. Like, all right, enough's enough. Our trick didn't work. Like, he didn't open the box; he just threw it straight into the incinerator. That was funny to me. Like, what's in the box? Lovecraft never tells us what's in the box. It's obviously something horrible, but Or characters don't see it, right? Like they throw it right into the fire, I guess. And if it's a head, I was thinking too, it was probably something from the grave, from the burial ground.
Yeah.
The grave, like
some parts somewhere.
Horribly shriveled
Yeah.
head with like maggots all over it or something like that. Although you'd think after 200 years they'd be pretty dry and like, but I don't know. Who knows, right? It was definitely something horrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, we never find out what's in the box. The mystery package, the post-prepaid package that was delivered to the doorstep by some skeleton men, I guess, who are like now walking around the city. Seemingly somewhat undisturbed, I guess. I mean, they did get reported in the newspaper for breaking into the asylum, but like they've been wandering around all around New England.
Yeah, after like eating several dozen people.
Yeah. But it's almost like, according to Lovecraft, there's this secret maze of tunnels under the ground that like the old settlers of New England maybe built or something like that, and then they're like all the undead are like wandering through these tunnels and they're able to come out wherever they want.
Yeah.
Secret catacombs under the ground linking Arkham and Boston or something like that. Yeah, I don't know. Why not, right? It's pretty horrible to think about, isn't it? Maybe under where you live right now, there's dead people trawling and burrowing under the ground. I don't know. This was fun. I had a lot of fun with this story, as you can probably tell.
Yeah, no, definitely fun. I mean, obviously flawed, but it has some really great scenes in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I enjoy this one. I do have a special affection for it, I think. It was one of the first Lovecraft stories I read, so I have a fondness for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely takes me back to like listening to it for the first time and hearing and yeah, like maybe not quite thinking about it in the same way that I do now. But that book really got to me, and so many of the things about it are enmeshed in my brain now. Yeah, I can reread the stories and think a little differently about them, but it's easy to feel why this stuff was formative for me and stuff. And I think that some people now don't get that, maybe because they hear about cosmic horror and stuff, and they get introduced to newer authors and they don't quite like maybe realize the power that Lovecraft can sometimes have when he's really, really on his game. Which this one, I mean, it has its moments, but yeah, maybe it's not that, but it's still definitely a fun read. So
yeah.
And there is apparently a really good graphic novel version, too, which I don't really know too much about, but it's apparently came out sometime in the last 20 years or something like that, and it's, like, gotten really good sort of artistic depictions of everything, and probably kind of does away with the recaps and stuff, too, right. I'd imagine. And so, yeah. So, yeah.
Cool. All right, well, what do we have for next time?
All right. So, that concludes this episode of Chrononauts. And next time we decided we're going to do something a little bit different. We've talked about William Hub Hodgson before on the podcast in 2 previous episodes this year, and we're going to revisit him again for one last time. What we've decided to do is read the Carnacki the Ghost Finder stories, of which there are 9, and we are essentially just going to sort of read through the stories and pick the ones that we really like, and we're just going to go around the circle, so to speak, and talk about our favorite or most notable 5 of the Carnacki stories, and then we're just going to kind of see if we have any left over after that, and what it amounts to. And what kind of brought this up was Carnacki is an example of a psychic detective. This was a phenomenon that was quite popular in the early 1900s, and there were quite a few notable examples. We will talk about more of those when we introduce the next episode. But Carnacki was perhaps one of the most scientific of the psychic detectives, and leaning a little bit more into science fiction with a lot of descriptions of electrical apparatus and so on to assist in his trapping of extra-dimensional forces and spirits and so on, and kind of adding that whole sort of physical scientific basis to certain things that we talked about before in a couple of previous episodes with spiritualism and mesmerism and stuff like that. So in a way, this is kind of revisiting some of those themes, but from a slightly different, perhaps slightly more materialist angle. And another interesting thing about the Karnaki stories is that there are occasions when the phenomenon described is in fact not quite of the supernatural type, and there is an actual quite rational, in terms of modern science and in terms of what people believed could be explicable at the time, way of describing exactly what happened. So part of the thing is determining, is this a real supernatural phenomenon? Is this something really uncanny and strange? Or is somebody just up to no good? And I think it's an interesting angle, and it's a chance for us to do something a little different, more casual. We're just going to read these stories, and we're going to talk about them in a very casual, sort of relaxed way. And we invite our audience to do the same thing. Read through the stories. They're public domain. They should be easily findable. There are only 9 of them, and none of them are very long. And maybe you'll have some thoughts. We certainly will, and we certainly plan to bring them to you next month. So now, as we finally cover up the graves we've managed to pilfer and rob during our scientific expeditions of great worthiness and care for the future of the human race, we must tell you all, make sure that your supplies of sanguinum are thoroughly maintained every 24 hours. Make sure that the head you keep in your pans are properly attended to. Make sure that your valves are set and your creatures can speak when you need them to speak. And above all, for God's sake, don't keep your leftovers buried in the cellar. Good night. We have been Chrononauts.